So this is how far the Afrikaans is going to go this evening. And I only speak English in self-defense, so I'll do my best. I'd like to welcome everybody online as well, so it's nice to have you guys. I forgot to promote it, that it's an online event as well. But between me and Anel, we decided, no, we're not going to say it's online. We want the people here. So welcome. I'm glad you are here tonight. John Grobler and Suzette, if you don't mind standing up, I just want to show, where's John? John, just stand, maybe you can come and stand here in the front if you don't mind. They are from Apologetics SA, their headquarters are in Pretoria, am I right? So are you planning to move it to Cape Town?
The moment the Lord says. Sodra die Here sê ons hier.
Okay. And I just want to honor you and thank you for bringing world-class teachers and speakers to South Africa, and thank you for bringing them to Cape Town as well. I'm not sure if you were Thomas McCuddy when he was here in the winter vacation. Well, it's Apologetics SA that brought them here. So thank you guys, really appreciate it. Just give them a hand of applause. Thank you guys. And then we've got Dr. Casey Luskin, and I'm going to call you and Dr. Brian Miller to the front as well, if you don't mind. If you can stand here. No, Dr. Brian's not going to talk tonight. Dr. Casey? Wait. Oh, yeah. You can stand in front of us. So these are the speakers that are here in South Africa. They are doing their rounds, and you are here till Sunday morning, and then you are leaving for Kenya. Kenya. Well, I hope you enjoy Kenya. I've never been there, so we appreciate you guys being here in South Africa. We appreciate you guys being here in Cape Town, and I just wanted to call you to the front as well, so that people can see. There's a lot of world-class speakers here. Just give them a hand of applause. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. So here we've got Dr. Casey Luskin, and the last few Sundays we were promoting this in church, so the people know you already.
All right.
They've Googled you and Wikipedia you and everything.
Good. They know all the terrible things people say about me then, so yeah.
Yeah, all the comments. So it's really a great honor. I just want to introduce him, Anel. Thank you for doing the write-up. Sorry, Dr. Casey, I just want to say, Anel is our contact with Apologetics SA. Anel, thank you very much. And Liesel, where's Liesel Krige? And yeah, so they are working together. So well done. Thank you for that. God bless you guys as well. So Dr. Casey Luskin is a man of great knowledge. He is a scientist and an attorney. That's an interesting story. Maybe you must make a podcast about how that happened. So he's an attorney, giving him expertise in both the scientific and legal dimensions to the debate over evolution, which is what we're going to talk tonight about. He holds a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg. I mean, one of the best universities in the world. Well, it's in the top 600.
It's a good school.
Yeah, it is.
Hey, I'm not complaining.
With a Bachelor's of Science and Master's Science degrees from the University of California, San Diego. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where he studied evolution extensively, also earned a law degree from the University of San Diego. Dr. Luskin has been a California licensed attorney since 2005.
But don't hold it against me, so yeah.
Yeah. Practicing primarily in the area of evolution education. So I guess you help teachers and...
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, in public schools and defending academic freedom of scientists who face discrimination because of their support of intelligent design. So just listen out for ID. Whenever you hear the word ID, it's an acronym for intelligent design.
That's good. Thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah, that's very important. Yeah.
My part is done here. In his role at Discovery Institute, Dr. Luskin worked as an associate director of the Center of Science and Culture, where he helps direct the ID 3.0 research program and assist and defend scientists, educators, and students who seek to freely study, research, and teach about the scientific debate over Darwinian evolution and intelligent design. So that's my story. I just want to read one verse and do a prayer review. And we know the apologetic verse is 1 Peter 3 verse 15 that says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Can I do a prayer for you?
Thank you.
Lord, I thank you that we can be here tonight on a Wednesday evening. I'm so impressed with all the people here tonight, and it's lovely to know that we can educate ourselves in your word and in science. And Lord, when I pray for Dr. Casey, that you'll give him the words and the knowledge that he's already got, so that he can teach us and give us that knowledge to give an answer whenever somebody asks that from us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Okay,
God bless you.
thank you so much.
Give a big hand of applause for Dr. Casey. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, it's great to be with you all tonight. I've been giving so many lectures lately that my voice is a little bit hoarse, so I apologize for that very much. But it is truly a very special thing to be back here in South Africa. As your pastor said, I did do my PhD at the University of Johannesburg. So my wife and I lived in Johannesburg for about 4 years, from 2016 to 2020. To make a very long story very short, I finished writing my PhD thesis the day after Ramaphosa announced the lockdown in March of 2020. And so we basically had to flee the country and go back to the USA because we were told that if we didn't go back, the borders might close, we might be stranded here forever, and it was going to get very complicated. So we had quite an escape from South Africa, but we did love our time in South Africa, and this is our first time back. So it's been really a wonderful thing. My wife has family all over the country, so actually we're seeing uncles and cousins and all kinds of family who live here in the Cape Town area. And whenever my wife and I would come to visit Cape Town, we would always say to ourselves, why did we go to school in Johannesburg? Why on earth did we not choose the University of Cape Town? It's so beautiful here. You guys live in just such an incredible area. Your pastor said that there would be no more Afrikaans for the night, and so that's mostly going to be true. My Afrikaans is basically non-existent, so please forgive me for that. You don't even want to hear me try. It'll just embarrass me and make you angry, so I'm not even going to go there. But there will be a little bit of Afrikaans in a couple of slides that we'll go through in just a minute. So the topic that I was asked to speak about is a topic that is one of my favorites, and that is basically the topic of human origins. Where did we come from? What does the scientific evidence say about human origins? And as I said, I did my PhD at the University of Johannesburg. My PhD was in geology. It was not specifically on the topic of paleoanthropology, which is the field that studies human origins, but it was related to the science of rocks and fossils and that sort of thing. And while I was living here in South Africa, I actually had quite a few opportunities to go and visit many of the famous hominid fossil sites in your country. It's actually, your country has some of the most famous hominid fossil sites in the world. And just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to the Cradle of Humankind and visited the Meropeng Museum? Okay, and then my follow-up question is, did you go there by choice, or were you taken there because of a school class? Was it choice or school class? Choice. Okay, very good. Well, that's great. And when I'm in Joburg, the majority of people raise their hands, and then I ask, is it choice or not? And almost everybody says, no, it was not choice. Because in Joburg, pretty much every high school student is taken to the Cradle of Humankind in order to basically be indoctrinated in the evolutionary story of human origins. But I've been to the Meropeng Museum quite a few times, and when I've been there, it's actually been a great learning experience for me. Not just to learn about, the science, but also to learn about what is the evolutionary perspective saying? What is the sort of the rhetoric that they're putting out there to the public about human origins? And so it's very helpful to sort of understand. I always want to understand what different viewpoints say and what they're articulating to the public, and you can learn about that at the Cradle of Humankind. In fact, you can see on this slide in the upper left, there's sort of that famous icon of evolution, this idea that, we started off as like an ape-like creature that's all stooped over, and very slowly over time, the fossils show that humanity walked upright until we evolved into modern human beings. This is a very famous icon of evolution that's used sort of as a way of promoting evolution to the public. But what I'm going to argue for you guys tonight is that the evidence does not actually support this view. When you look at the scientific evidence and the scientific technical literature, we're talking about the peer-reviewed scientific literature that scientists talk about in their scientific journals, that it does not support this evolutionary story. But as I said, I had many opportunities to study hominid fossil sites while I was living in South Africa. These are actually some photos I took of the Sterkfontein site at the Cradle of Humankind when I got to go on a tour there. And this is actually some photos I took when I got to go for a sampling expedition at the Cradle of Humankind. I actually got to assist with taking some samples that were used to date some of the rocks and fossils there. I got to help do the sampling. My lab at the University of Johannesburg was asked to assist with this. It wasn't part of my PhD research, but it was really a fun thing. And you can see actually in this photo on the right, we were sampling in a cave there where there are actually fossils of large cats that are embedded in the cave wall. So I'm standing next to this giant cat skull that's sort of just, sitting there in the cave wall. It was really extraordinary. So in outline of what we're going to talk about tonight, we're going to start by talking about what is the evolutionary view, because I think it is important for us to understand what the evolutionary view is before we critique it, especially since this is the view that many of you are either have already learned in schools or you're going to learn in schools. We need to understand it before we actually try to critique it and say what might be wrong with it. Secondly, we're going to talk about this scientific field called paleoanthropology. What is paleoanthropology and what is sort of some of the controversies in that field? We're going to talk about the various fossils that have been discovered regarding human origins, starting with some of the early fossils that are called the early hominins, and how those fossils often get hyped to the public as the latest human ancestors, but what does the evidence really say? Then we'll talk about another group of fossils called the Australopithecines, and whether or not they really can serve as an ancestor to our species. Then we'll talk about some supposed intermediate links that have been discovered, some of the very famous fossils that have come out of South Africa in the last few years. We'll then talk about the origin of our own species. We are species Homo sapiens, right? It means wise man in Latin. And our genus Homo, we're going to talk about how it does not appear in a gradualistic manner that is predicted by Darwin's theory. And then finally, we'll talk about our genus Homo and how the main members of the genus Homo are very human-like and actually show that we are not descended from ape-like or primitive ancestors. Okay, and just so you guys know, if you guys are interested in digging deeper on this topic, there are 3 books where I've contributed chapters about the science of human origins. And in particular, this one at the top here, Science and Faith and Dialogue, it's actually a free ebook. So at the very end of the talk, I'm going to put a QR code on the screen. So this is to encourage you guys to not leave before the end. But stick around, you'll get to take a photo with your phone, and you can download that book as a free ebook. It's actually published by a South African academic publisher called AOSIS. And Dr. Brian Miller, who you just saw, also has a wonderful chapter in that book. And we partnered with a professor at Northwest University of Potchefstroom and a couple faculty members there actually who edited the book and helped to get it published from a South African publisher. So I was very excited to be able to publish in a South African book. So let's talk about the science of human origins and the field of paleoanthropology. What is paleoanthropology? Paleoanthropology is a field of science. It's specifically a subfield of anthropology which studies hominid fossils and the origin of humans. And the mainstream view in this field is that humans evolved by blind and unguided evolutionary mechanisms from ape-like ancestors. If you ask any, mainstream scientist in this field, almost every single one will say, okay, yes, the evidence shows that we evolved from ape-like ancestors via strictly blind and unguided Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms. And the reason I say blind and unguided is because what they will claim is that there is no evidence for any intelligent design, any involvement of a creator or a divine being or an intelligent agent in the history of human life. If you look at the history of human life, all you will find are blind natural causes. And what they would say is that we share a common ancestor with living apes. That's the way that mainstream science would frame it. And they would say essentially that if you guys ever heard the famous story of somebody said, there's this Hindu view that the earth rests on the back of a turtle, and somebody says, well, what is the turtle standing on? And they said, oh, well, it's turtles all the way down. It's an old funny story. Well, if you ask mainstream scientists how humans evolved, they will say that it is natural causes all the way down. There's only blind and unguided evolutionary mechanisms and other natural causes all the way down to the first cause in the universe. So this is supposed to be, the world standing on Darwin's back, and it's sort of just nothing but natural blind causes all the way down. There's no room for intelligent design. There's no room for divine involvement or God or any of that. And this is unfortunately the view that dominates in the academy today. This is the way that most scientists will approach this issue. But what was really a wake-up moment for me was when I realized that the idea that there is no intelligent design, there's no divine involvement from a creator involved, that idea is not actually a conclusion that they make from the data. It is a starting assumption, okay? Before they even go to the table, before they even take out their shovels and start to dig into the ground, they start off with the assumption from the very beginning that there has been no intelligent intervention in the history of life on Earth, that it has been strictly evolutionary mechanisms. And once I came to realize this, and you can actually see evolutionary scientists in many of their papers and their writings, they will admit that they assume that naturalism is true. Naturalism, of course, is the idea that there's only matter and energy. And they will take this view that they call methodological naturalism, where they assume, for the sake of doing science, that there is only natural causes at work and there's no intelligent design, there's no involvement from God whatsoever. And once I realized that this was just an assumption, it kind of helped me to sort of start to look at the whole evolutionary field in a different way. I didn't just see it as like conclusions that were being strongly supported by the scientific evidence, but rather they are claims that are built upon assumptions. And if you can think critically about what's actually going on and realize that there are so many philosophical assumptions that go into their interpretations of the data, it's like when you're in the Matrix and suddenly you take the red pill and you suddenly realize that things are not what you had been told. It's not the way that you thought it was. That many of these claims that we see in favor of evolution, they're not actually based upon hard evidence. They're based upon assumptions about what happened. The assumption that evolution is true. The assumption that all living species share a common ancestor. The assumptions that the only forces that were at work in generating our species were blind and unguided evolutionary mechanisms. So it's really important to understand these assumptions before we start to talk about this, because they play a major role in how these claims are made. Okay, so we're going to be using these terms hominid and hominin quite a bit tonight, and I want to define them for you really quickly because unfortunately they're actually used in an inconsistent way, even among scientists. So sometimes scientists will call a hominid any member of what they call family Hominidae, and that would include humans, but also the living great apes, so chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. Other times they will use the term hominid to refer to any species that lies on this branch here that is the one that includes human beings, that goes back to the common ancestor that we supposedly shared with chimpanzees. And this is typically how the term is used in the field of paleoanthropology. So tonight, if I talk about a hominid or a hominin, I'm going to be talking about any species that belongs to this branch, this evolutionary branch that supposedly led to human beings after this most recent common ancestor that we supposedly share with chimpanzees. So again, South Africa actually has a very, very rich history in terms of its hominid fossil finds. One of the first famous hominid fossils was the Taung child, found at the Taung, I believe it's a quarry in the city of Taung. I actually got to visit there once. But there's many other hominid fossil sites. Here in the Cape, you have the Blombos Cave, you have Saldanha Man, some Stone Age tools that were found, also the Classes River Caves. But of course, the most famous site is the cradle of humankind, where there have been many fossil discoveries, including, of course, Homo naledi. How many of you guys have heard of Homo naledi? I'm sure that you've heard about it. It's been in the news quite a bit over the last few years. And Homo naledi is, frankly, it is probably the largest number of bones ever discovered in a single cave anywhere in the field of paleoanthropology. So it's a really fantastic find just from a purely scientific standpoint of wanting to, discover a lot of bones. There are some problems with the claims they made about Homo naledi. We'll get to that in a little while. But at least, you guys should be proud that your country has produced a lot of really interesting fossils. So let's now talk about the evolutionary view of human origins, because it's important to understand what they are claiming. As your pastor said, I often get involved with education debates in the United States over how to teach evolution in public schools. And back in 2009, the state of Texas had a very large debate over how to teach evolution. And what happened was both sides brought in experts to testify how they think evolution should be taught. Discovery Institute, where I work, we brought in some experts who testified that students should learn about both the evidence for and against evolution. We weren't trying to get evolution removed from the schools because we recognize that, it is a very influential idea. Students should understand it. But we thought that when they do learn about it, they should not just be indoctrinated in the evidence for evolution. They should also learn about the evidence that challenges evolution. So that's what we said. Unfortunately, there were some experts on the other side, some evolutionary scientists, who basically said students should learn only the evidence for evolution, and that basically any of the scientific evidence that challenges evolution should be censored from students. Well, we proved to the Texas State Board of Education that that evidence does exist. We actually gave them a binder of over this huge binder that we slapped on the table, over 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers that challenge core claims from evolution as they are being made in the textbooks. And thankfully, the Texas State Board of Education actually agreed with us, and they voted in favor of teaching students about both the strengths and the weaknesses of evolution. But one of the experts that testified on the other side was an anthropologist from Southern Methodist University named Ronald Wetherington. And he's a smart guy, and I'm not here to attack him personally or anything like that, but I want to present to you what he stated to the Texas State Board of Education that day when he was testifying, because I think that it really reflects the common view that we are told in the public, when we watch Netflix documentaries, or when we go to these hominid fossil museums, or when you're learning about evolution in schools, they will present this kind of a view. So he said that human evolution has arguably the most complete sequence of fossil succession of any mammal in the world. He said that there are no gaps and no lack of transitional fossils. So what is he saying? According to Darwin's theory of evolution, when one type of organism evolves into another type of organism, it happens very slowly and gradually. And this is supposed to leave sort of a trail of this evolutionary pathway in the fossil record. So according to the standard evolutionary view, if we evolved from ape-like ancestors, you should find these fossils in the fossil record that are documenting this sort of slow, gradual change, showing what they call transitional fossils. And he claimed that the human fossil record is rich in these transitional fossils. He said there are no gaps whatsoever. He went on to say that human origins provides a nice, clean example of what Darwin thought was a gradualistic evolutionary change. While I was listening to this professor testify, I knew that when you actually dig in to the scientific literature, you read what the scientists are saying in the mainstream papers that they're publishing in journals, that a very different story is told. And I'm not accusing Professor Wetherington of lying or anything like that. I mean, I'm sure that he believes what he was saying, but this really reflects sort of this dumbed down version of evolution that is pushed on the public and often taught to students because they don't want to really expose students to what are some of the problems with the theory. They just want to say, well, this is the general picture and don't worry about the details. But the problem is when you actually dig into the details and you read what's in the mainstream scientific literature, you find out that a very different story is being told. And so I want to present to you guys that story today and what I've learned about this topic. So I said that there wouldn't be very much Afrikaans, but actually there's a little bit of Afrikaans here. This is actually two images that were sent to me. I don't know where they came from. Do you know, Renell, did you send these? Okay, so are these scans of textbooks? I'm guessing, yeah. So, and I'm assuming these are probably what our students are learning in the schools here. And basically you can see here this icon of evolution, right? We see this idea that humans gradually evolved from very primitive species, and eventually they get more and more human-like. And then I can't read any of this, I'll leave this to you guys, but it's basically saying that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors and that there are, basically fossils that document how humans evolved from these ape-like species. This is very common. In fact, we see this in, biology textbooks in the United States all the time. And again, this is that famous gradual ape-to-man icon of evolution at the cradle of humankind. It's actually their logo is an icon, but this icon has been heavily criticized even by mainstream science because it's not true. We don't see this very gradual progression of fossils. So throughout this talk, I am going to take a critical look at various claims that are made at the world-famous Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum at the Cradle of Humankind. So for those of you who have been there or maybe will go there in the future, maybe you'll remember some of this and we can talk about whether their claims are true. So just to summarize the evolutionary view for you guys, this is a diagram that shows the supposed fossil progression, and it may be a little bit far away for you guys to see some of the details. So I'll just give you guys the general outline here. In the bottom left, we're supposed to have what we call the early hominin fossils. And these are supposed to be some of the earliest fossils that branched off from our common ancestor that we supposedly shared with chimpanzees. And these are supposed to be some of the first fossils or the first species that were walking upright, kind of like we do. Okay, so we say they were bipedal. They walked upright on two legs. And these lived from about 5 to 7 million years ago. But then around, and these fossils, by the way, are very fragmented. We don't have very complete specimens of these fossils. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. Then around 2 to 4.5 million years ago, and by the way, I'm going to throw out a bunch of dates for you guys, and I know that sometimes that can be controversial. So I just want to say this. For the sake of this talk, I'm just going to be sort of accepting the mainstream ages of these fossils as they are being promoted in the scientific papers. And what I'm going to say is that, look, even if we accept the mainstream ages, then that does not show, even if we take the ages of these fossils at face value, we still do not see good evidence for human evolution. So I personally do come from what we call an old Earth perspective, where I don't really have a problem with the idea that fossils can be very old. But what I'm trying to say to you guys is, whether you take a more of a young Earth view or an old Earth view, whatever your view is, if we just take these, for the sake of the argument, just to, accept the ages, then we still do not see good evidence for evolution in the fossil record, okay? So getting back to this diagram, we have the Australopithecines who lived from about 2 to 4.5 million years ago, according to the mainstream view. And they are supposed to be direct ancestors of our human species. Of course, I'm skeptical of that. I'm going to explain to you guys why in just a little while. But this is a very common view. And then we get into the genus Homo. The genus Homo contains species that actually look very, very similar to us. We're talking about species like Homo erectus or the Neanderthals. You might be thinking, looking similar to us, aren't these supposed to be primitive, ape-like ancestors of humans? Well, if you look at what the scientific evidence says, they actually looked very, very similar to us. We'll talk about this more in a little while, to the point that some mainstream evolutionary scientists even have proposed that they should be considered as members of our own species. They were not necessarily different from you and me, and they were not necessarily unintelligent brutes. We might consider them to just be like, members of the human species, just like the rest of us. So it's a very different perspective than I think you would get from the mainstream evolutionary view. So this is the standard sort of evolutionary phylogeny of human evolution. We're going to go through this and talk about some various key points where the evidence does not support these evolutionary claims. And what we're going to see is that hominid fossils generally fit into two categories. We have ape-like species and human-like species with a large unbridged gap between them. And I'm going to argue that the hominid fossil record does not document the evolution of humans from ape-like precursors. So let's continue on talking about this field of paleoanthropology. The field of paleoanthropology is fragmented in multiple ways. First of all, the fossils themselves are fragmented. Second of all, the fossil record is very fragmented. And third, the field of paleoanthropology is fragmented. What do I mean by this? Well, this is a quote from Stephen Jay Gould, who was a very famous paleontologist at Harvard University. He said, most hominid fossils, even though they serve as a basis for endless speculation and elaborate storytelling, are fragments of jaws and scraps of skulls. So most of the time when we find these hominid fossils, there's just a few bone scraps that are there. In fact, we often will see these hominid fossil constructions, right? Very common, you see these in textbooks, where it seems like we have a really good idea of what these species look like, but the reality is frequently we have actually very limited fossil remains. And what I find interesting about these fossil reconstructions is they will often make the ape-like creatures look more human and look more intelligent, and then they'll make the human-like creatures look really unintelligent and stupid. So we often will say they're trying to apify humans and humanize the apes. So in this picture you see on the upper right, that's supposed to be a member of Australopithecus, and it looks like it's having like its first thought or something like that. But then on the bottom right, we see a species called Homo erectus. Well, Homo erectus is depicted all stooped over, but the name Homo erectus means upright walking man. In fact, they did walk upright, and below the neck, they're almost identical to you and me. Even their brain size is within the range of modern human genetic variation. So depicting Homo erectus as this sort of like stooped over, bungling form goes totally against what the fossil evidence says. So you have to be very careful whether we should trust these hominid reconstructions. These are actually a couple photographs I took at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And once again, we see that the Australopithecines, these are ape-like creatures that had a brain about the size of a chimpanzee, okay? But the one on the left is depicted as if it's looking up at the stars, again, having these really glamorous thoughts. And the one on the right is smiling. These things had brains about the size of a chimp. I can guarantee you they were not looking up and pondering the stars, okay? They just did not have that degree of intelligence. I can't even read this quote because it's too small, but suffice to say, this is a quote from a Harvard paleoanthropologist named Ernst Houghton. And what he was saying is that we should be very cautious and careful about trusting hominid reconstructions because they really mislead people. He said, these alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value and are likely only to mislead the public. So put not your trust in reconstructions. And actually, here's some more reconstructions, again, sent to me by Anel. Is this from a textbook again? Yeah. So you can see these reconstructions, and again, you have to realize that there's a lot of subjectivity and sort of interpretation that goes into these reconstructions. Okay, so the fossil record is also very fragmented. This is a quote from an article in the journal Science from a number of years ago, but it says, the primary scientific evidence is a pitifully small array of bones from which to construct man's evolutionary history. One anthropologist has compared this task to that of reconstructing the plot of War and Peace with 13 randomly selected pages. And they said that conflicts tend to last longer because it is difficult to conclusively find evidence to send a theory packing. So there's so little evidence that people will, continue to fight over it because it's very difficult to know how to interpret it. And so in this picture of the cover of War and Peace, to sort of illustrate the problem, I broke that up into just 13 small little squares. And imagine trying to reconstruct this image of the cover of this book from just a few squares. Well, this is not at all unlike what is going on in the hominid fossil record. Yes, we have a few bones here and a few bones there, but they're very fragmentary and disconnected. And the claim that all these different species are related through evolutionary ancestry, that is an interpretation that you are imposing upon the data. It's not necessarily coming directly from the data itself. So the fossils themselves are highly fragmented. The record is also highly fragmented. This is a quote from another Harvard scientist named Richard Lewontin. He said, when we consider the remote past, before the origin of the actual species Homo sapiens, we are faced with a fragmentary and disconnected fossil record. Despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no hominid fossil species can be established as our direct ancestor. So he's saying that when we look at the record is highly fragmented. There are often very long periods of time for which we don't have any fossils. I love this quote. This is from an evolutionary scientist named Jerry Coyne. He's a very outspoken atheist and evolutionist. But even he admits that paleoanthropology is a field in which the subjects far outnumber the objects of study. So there are more scientists in the field looking at these fossils than there are actually fossils or specimens themselves. I find that to be very interesting. It tells you something about the nature of the evidence in this field. And this is a quote from the scientist who actually discovered Lucy, the very famous hominid. He says that about half the time span in the last 3 million years remains undocumented by any human fossils. So this, of course, is a bit of an older quote. I'm sure they filled in some of the gaps now, but those gaps are not necessarily pointing to evolution. But the point is that there are huge periods of time for which we do not have fossils, and I think it still remains that the record is highly fragmented. Finally, the field of paleoanthropology is highly fragmented. This is a quote from a science writer named Roger Lewin. And he talks about when you listen to what is basically going on in the field, there's a lot of acrimony and infighting. He says, an emotionally charged atmosphere permeates paleoanthropology because of something akin to ancestor worship, causing bitter rivalries such that paleoanthropology literature is replete with references to controversy, disagreements, and even personal battles. And I agree with what he's saying here very much. I've read quite a few books by paleoanthropologists, and I can tell you when you read their books, they will regale you with tales of infighting between various research teams. Sometimes one research team will get so mad at another research team, they won't even let them have access to the bones. So there's a lot of difficulty getting, I would say, an objective take, and sort of, in science, you're supposed to allow other scientists to evaluate your work and double check if you did it right. But if you're basically prohibiting other scientists from having access to the bones, how can they double check your claims and see if what you're saying is actually true? So there's a lot of problems in the field of paleoanthropology. This is a great quote. This is from a documentary producer who was making a documentary about Neanderthals. and he said, each Neanderthal expert I talked to thought the last one I talked to was an idiot, if not an actual Neanderthal. So I think this is sort of very reflective of what we see in the field. So evolutionary paleoanthropologists commonly disagree, and the field is fragmented. If you just read books by paleoanthropologists, you'll get a sense for this of how fragmented the field really is. So a senior editor at the journal Nature named Henry Gee, very smart guy, I like his writing a lot, he says, fossil evidence of human evolutionary history is fragmentary and open to various interpretations. I think that's a very honest and candid statement. But the question that I would want to ask is this: what about non-evolutionary interpretations? Are we allowed to make non-evolutionary interpretations, or is this philosophy of methodological naturalism prohibiting scientists from even considering the possibility that the evolutionary model is not true? Are we allowed to even go there? I'm going to go there tonight. I hope you guys will, at least hear me out what I have to say. But I think that that's unfortunate if folks are not open to non-evolutionary interpretations, because science is supposed to be open to all kinds of different possibilities. So let's talk about some of the early hominins. This is a species called Aurorantugensis, or Millennium Man. It was discovered right around the time of the turn of the millennium. And when this is one of the early hominins, one of the first species that is supposed to represent, some of the first upright walking hominids that evolved very soon after we split from the other line that led to chimpanzees and apes. Or I guess chimpanzees in this case. So when these fossils are often discovered, you will see that initially they are often promoted to the public with great fanfare, okay? So initially there's going to be a flood of newspaper stories saying, oh, we found a new human ancestor. So this fossil was no exception. The New York Times had a headline, "Fossils may be earliest human link." Now, what was interesting is that, yes, this is a drawing of the bones that were found from these fossils, or this fossil, and largely what was found were bone scraps, but at least in this case, they did have part of a femur. If you found part of a femur, you are doing very, very well in the field of paleoanthropology. But at the end of the day, despite the claims that this might have been an upright walking species, a Yale University Press book in 2007 said, all in all, there is currently precious little evidence bearing on how Auroran moved. We really don't have enough evidence to say for sure what its mode of locomotion was. What I mean by that is, how did it walk? Did it walk upright? Was it a quadruped walking on four limbs? How exactly did it walk? We just don't have enough evidence to say for sure. Another good example of what I call the hominin hype comes from this species, Ardipithecus ramidus. It was discovered back in the 1990s, but for various reasons, because the fossil was in such poor condition, it took them almost 15 years to publish the papers about this fossil. So in 2009, when this fossil was first sort of presented to the world, again we saw this sort of flood of newspaper articles and media stories presenting it as the latest human ancestor. So Discovery Channel said, Artie, oldest human ancestor unveiled. The Associated Press, world's oldest human link skeleton found. Or Science magazine called it the breakthrough of the year. And in fact, one of the lead Artie researchers from UC Berkeley, Tim White, said that Artie is the Rosetta Stone for understanding bipedalism. And of course, bipedalism means upright walking. So Artie is going to show us how bipedalism evolved and what it looks like in these early hominins. The problem was that when Artie was first discovered, the fossil was in very poor condition. And I read a bunch of news stories and scientific papers talking about Artie, and I discovered this was readily admitted. In fact, Time magazine said that some portions of Artie's skeleton were found crushed nearly to smithereens and needed extensive digital reconstruction, okay? So that's fine. Scientists are allowed to reconstruct fossils. You have to do that. But we have to understand that when they do these reconstructions, they are using often their own preconceived notions about how this fossil would have walked or what it looked like or where it fits in the overall evolutionary scheme when they do the reconstructions, okay? So again, the fossil was in a very poor condition. It was said that the pelvis looked like an Irish stew. This is really important, you guys, because the pelvis is a very important bone for determining how an organism walks. If the pelvis initially looked like an Irish stew, that does not inspire a lot of confidence that we actually have a good idea of the way that this organism walked. They said the fossil looked like roadkill. It was squished. It was chalky. It was distorted. It was crushed to smithereens. Look, I've driven around South Africa enough when I did my PhD research. I saw a lot of roadkill, let me tell you guys, okay? And so you don't want to find a fossil that looks like roadkill. That is not going to help you have a good understanding of how that fossil actually looked. So what we see in sort of the public rhetoric regarding these hominid fossils is we see a similar pattern that frequently goes on over and over again. Initially, when the fossil is first discovered, you see it sort of promoted to the public as the latest human ancestor with all this hype. But then wait 6 to 10 to 12 months, maybe a year or two, and you will find that eventually cooler heads will start to prevail, and they will publish papers in the scientific literature that will be highly critical of the initial hyped findings. Now, the problem is that the newspapers and the media and Netflix, they only pick up on the hype, right? They don't report when a paper is published a year or two later that criticizes the claims that were made that led to the hype in the first place. So the public is not often informed about what's really going on with the evidence. But eventually, there were papers published here's one in the journal Science, that was critical of the claim that Artie walked upright like we did. And this paper said that all of the Ardipithecus ramidus bipedal characters cited also serve the mechanical requisites of quadrupedality. That's a very complicated way of saying it probably walked on all fours. The evidence is also consistent with it having been something like a knuckle walker, like an ape, not an upright walking species like a human. Another article in the journal Nature. Nature is arguably the top scientific journal in the world. It published a paper saying the claim that Ardipithecus ramidus was a facultative terrestrial biped is vitiated because it is based on highly speculative inferences and on relatively few features. So highly critical of this claim that Ardipithecus ramidus was a quadruped, that it was a biped. Very, very critical of this claim. In fact, one of the scientists who published one of these papers said that he regards the hype around Artie to have been overblown. I was very grateful to see a scientist acknowledging the hype and being critical of that. In fact, just a couple years ago, there was a very much later paper that was published that found that Artie had the hands of a tree climber and a knuckle walker and basically had a chimp-like mode of locomotion. So again, wait a little while and the hype dies down and you see that cooler heads prevail and the evidence challenges the initial claims of this upright walking human ancestor that we find in the news. Here's the last example of this. This is another early hominin. It was discovered and also in the early 2000s. It's called Sahelanthropus chadensis. It was found in the country of Chad. And Nature, the journal Nature, said it could be the earliest known hominid ancestor. How many of you guys have heard of Bill Nye the Science Guy, just out of curiosity? He's obviously sort of this quirky, funny guy. Yeah, I used to watch Bill Nye after school when I was a kid in high school, and he would teach you how to do your chemistry homework or how to blow things up for fun, right? It turns out he's also sort of a hardcore atheist who thinks that parents should not be able to teach their kids that there are problems with evolution. So he's actually sort of a very dogmatic materialist. But he wrote a book a few years ago talking about this fossil, and he said, fossil hunters have found a whole range of human ancestors, including Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is a no longer missing link. And then the Smithsonian Institution called this fossil one of the oldest known species in the human family tree. Well, again, dig into the technical literature and you find a different story being told. Another technical paper in the journal Nature said that many features link the specimen with chimpanzees, gorillas, or both, to the exclusion of hominids. Sahelanthropus was an ape. And an article that came out a few years ago looked at the femur of this fossil and found that it was a femur that was from a quadruped with a chimp-like body plan. And an article in the journal New Scientist commenting on this quoted a scientist saying that this fossil is more similar to a chimp than to any other hominin. So again, highly critical of these hyped up claims. So those are the early hominins. And with the early hominins, we really have very fragmented fossils, like I said. But now when you come a little bit later, we come to the Australopithecines. And we have more fossils of the Australopithecines to the point where, in general, we have a pretty decent idea of what they looked like. So what were the Australopithecines? Well, their name literally means southern ape. They lived from about 1.9 to 4.5 million years ago. Their brain and their body was about the size of a chimpanzee. And a very complete and one of the most famous specimens is the specimen Lucy, which belonged to the species Australopithecus afarensis. And this is actually a drawing of the bones that were found from Lucy. what I actually was very surprised to find out is that even though Lucy is so famous and she's one of the most complete specimens, only 40% of her skeleton was found. In fact, in 2009, Lucy was taking her bones were going on a tour of the world, and they came to a science museum in Seattle, where I live, and I got to go see Lucy's bones. And it was really incredible to see. Yes, it is a very spectacular fossil find, but it's only 40% complete. That is considered really, really good in the field of paleoanthropology. Another reason why Lucy's fossil is considered to be very good is because they did find part of the pelvis, one of the femurs, and part of a tibia, which they can use to help to form a knee joint. So the claim about Lucy is that basically Lucy was like an ape-sized creature with an ape-sized head that walked upright like we do, okay? So it's sort of like this miniaturized, ape-like creature, but it was walking around just like modern humans. But it's important to understand that there are many Australopithecine traits that are either ape-like and or not human-like, and these include their arms, their chest, their striding gait, their shoulders, their abdomen, their inner ear canals, which are very important, by the way, for determining the way you walk. If you ever have an inner ear infection, you know that it affects your balance. So inner ear canals, the fact that they were ape-like in Australopithecines might tell you something about the way they walked. Their developmental patterns were also ape-like. Their toes, their teeth, their hand bones, and their brain size were all ape-like and or not human-like. But again, the claim is that Lucy was this upright walking species. This is actually a photograph from the Maripang Fossil Museum on the far right there. And so it's important to understand that, when we look at the technical literature, you can find stark disagreement with this claim that Lucy walked upright like we do. The hand bones of Lucy, according to a paper in Nature, found that she knuckle walked as chimps and gorillas do. There was an article in New Scientist that found that many of her traits were suitable for climbing in trees, and that Lucy probably spent a lot of time in trees and had an arboreal lifestyle. In fact, there was a paper published a couple of years ago that proposed that the reason Lucy died is because she actually fell out of a tree. And so, maybe she did live in trees. There was an article, so when we talk about the pelvis and whether or not Lucy's pelvis shows that she walked upright, there was an article in a scientific journal which found that her pelvis was initially very badly crushed with distortion and cracking. This is kind of like the story with Artie, right? The pelvis was initially in very bad condition, so they had to reconstruct it. Well, once again, what is going on with these reconstructions? Is there some subjectivity? Well, another article said that there was air in the reconstruction, which created it created a very human-like sacral plane that went against the evidence. And so another article in the Journal of Human Evolution said that prevailing views of Lucy's posture are almost impossible to reconcile. To resolve such differences, more anatomical fossil evidence is needed. The available data at present are open to widely different interpretations. So essentially, we don't have enough fossil evidence to say for sure how Lucy walked. Another paleoanthropologist said that Australopithecines are often thought to have had a mosaic of modern human and modern ape features, or worse, are regarded as a group of failed humans. Australopithecines were neither of these. So when you look at Lucy's femur, you find that something called the bicondylar angle was actually much greater in the Australopithecines than it is in humans. The bicondylar angle basically determines the angle at which your femur will angle down from the hip towards the knees. And Australopithecines actually had a larger bicondylar angle than modern humans do. So the way I would see Lucy's ability to walk is she probably spent a lot of time in trees. When she was on the ground, she was capable of knuckle walking, but when she was in the trees, she had these long arms so she could hold on to a branch above her, and because of this very high bicondylar angle, she would have walked like this, able to put one foot in front of the other very easily to walk on tree limbs. So I would say that Lucy had a form of locomotion that was probably, even when she was able to walk upright in a bipedal manner, it was probably very well adapted for walking in trees. So this article in the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution asked the question, are there fossils that show how the Australopithecines evolved into our genus Homo, essentially evolving into the first human-like members of the fossil record? And it said that no gradual series of changes in earlier Australopithecine populations clearly leads to the new species, talking about early Homo, and no Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. This goes against what many evolutionary scientists will claim, that they were directly ancestral to us. Another paleoanthropologist said, Australopithecines are like apes, and the Homo group are like humans. Something major occurred when Homo evolved, and it wasn't just in the brain. We'll get to the evolution of our genus Homo in just a minute, but first we want to talk about these supposed intermediates which supposedly link the Australopithecines to our genus Homo. One of the earliest candidates that was given for an intermediate link was a species called Homo habilis. I'm just curious, how many of you guys have heard of Homo habilis? It's a name that's often tossed around in these conversations. However, it's been called an intermediate link between the ape-like Australopithecines and our genus Homo, but when you dig into the technical literature, you find very severe criticisms of claims that it was an evolutionary intermediate. An article in Nature talking about the skull of habilis said that it represents an unlikely intermediate between the morphology seen in Australopithecines and Homo erectus. And an article in the Journal of Human Evolution said it is difficult to accept an evolutionary sequence in which Homo habilis, with less human-like locomotor adaptations, is intermediate between Australopithecus and fully bipedal Homo erectus. And this paper actually found that Homo habilis is more similar to Australopithecines and apes than it is to modern humans. Some people have even questioned whether or not Homo habilis is a real species. Ian Tattersall, a very famous paleoanthropologist from the US, he calls Homo habilis a wastebasket taxon, little more than a convenient recipient for a motley assortment of fossils. What he's saying is it's a place where you basically you'll assign fossils to Homo habilis if you don't know what else to do with them. And it's not really a very clear species that actually existed. At the Meropeng Museum, it was claimed that this species was the earliest species to use tools. In fact, literally the name Homo habilis means handy man. So it's said to be intermediate because it was the first species that used tools. But when you actually dig into the scientific literature, you find, again, I won't read this long quote, but it's saying that the association between Homo habilis and tool use has proven highly dubious. We really don't see good evidence that specifically links Homo habilis to the use of tools. It's sort of always inferred. Yes, you can find tools, but we don't really know who made those tools or what species they were used by. So there was a study in a major scientific book about evolution, and also an article in the journal Science a few years back, which looked at all of the body traits in Homo habilis. It looked at the body size, the body shape, the locomotion, the jaws and the teeth, the development and the brain size, and it found that across the board, in every single one of these characters, Homo habilis actually is not belonging to the genus Homo, where you would have an H. It actually belongs to the genus Australopithecus. And they said, actually, this species should be called Australopithecus habilis, not Homo habilis, and it doesn't even belong as part of our genus Homo. It doesn't belong in our ancestry. So if you look at this diagram, the A's across the board showed that it was very unlike modern humans. It was much more like the Australopithecines. It does not belong in the genus Homo. So if Homo habilis is really Australopithecus habilis, then we no longer have it as a link, and we're left with this major discontinuity between the Australopithecines and our genus Homo. That's a problem. We have sort of a gap in the fossil record. We don't have fossils that are documenting how the Australopithecines evolved into our genus Homo. Now, a few years ago, though, there was a new discovery which many scientists thought was going to plug this gap, and this is Homo naledi. And again, how many of you guys have heard of Homo naledi? I'm sure that many of you guys heard about this because it was discovered at the cradle of humankind. It was really promoted in the news. In fact, how many of you guys have seen the new Netflix documentary that just came out about Homo naledi? Any of you guys watched this yet? Okay. Well, I don't know if you guys even have Netflix, but I have to watch this because it's part of my job. So I'm actually in the middle of watching this documentary right now. But suffice to say for the moment, when Homo naledi was first discovered, we saw this exact same pattern of hyping a new fossil to the public. So CNN ran the headline, Homo naledi, new species of human ancestor discovered in South Africa. The Daily Mail, scientists discover skull of new human ancestor, Homo naledi. PBS, trove of fossils from a long-lost human ancestor. Now, of course, it was a trove, a really great discovery of many, many bones, and this is very exciting. But to get it, you have to, get past the media hype and get into the scientific literature to find out what's really going on with Homo naledi, and you find a very different story being told. So the claim was that Homo naledi was basically It had a chimp-sized brain, an australopith-sized brain, but it was something that was a human ancestor. But unfortunately, many of its traits actually do not indicate that it was a good candidate for a human ancestor. It had long, curved fingers and toes, which indicate that it was a tree climber. I won't bore you with these quotes, but these quotes are basically saying that the hands and the foot of Homo naledi were well adapted for climbing in trees. It probably spent a lot of time in trees, much like Lucy. But it had a weird mosaic of traits, and it was really unique and distinct from anything else we'd ever discovered. In fact, one of the lead naledi researchers, Lee Berger, said in the New York Times, the species is quite different from anything else we have seen. And by the way, Lee Berger, I do need to give him some credit, because it's very difficult to get into the cave where they found the bones of Homo naledi. There's like a little bottleneck where they initially were hiring, they said they wanted to hire petite females who were good at, doing spelunking, climbing in caves, to go and analyze and excavate these bones. Because anybody who was too large would not be able to fit through this bottleneck. Well, Lee Berger actually lost enough weight. He's a big guy. He lost enough weight to actually go into this cave and make it through the bottleneck. And I think, if I recall, he actually might have hurt his shoulder or dislocated his shoulder or something like that trying to get through the bottleneck. So I respect the fact that he took some serious sacrifices trying to do science here. I do disagree with a lot of his scientific claims, but I respect, that he did this trying to be able to have access to these bones. So there are some very serious controversies in the scientific community over some of the claims being made about Homo naledi, that it was a human ancestor. One of the biggest claims that was made, and this is talked about in the Netflix documentary, is that Homo naledi buried its dead. And this is supposed to show sort of very advanced human intellectual abilities, advanced human cultural abilities, and it's supposed to, reflect them sort of evolving into a very high-thinking kind of species. So the question is, did Homo naledi actually bury its dead? The claim has been made that in the cave where they found all these bones, this was actually a burial cave. So I'm skeptical of this, because burying the dead in this cave where it was found would require shimming through a very steep, narrow crevice. This is where Lee Berger almost got stuck. It would require them dragging a body long distances in the dark, something that would be very physically challenging for any hominid of any level of intelligence. Human beings with all of our technology, we can barely get in there. So I don't think it's a very good explanation this was a burial ground. Find somewhere simpler to bury your dead than the back of this dark cave where they would have had, no way to get there, no way to see, probably very easy to get trapped. And once you're down there, it's very, very challenging. So many scientists, including two of Lee Berger's colleagues at the University of Witwatersrand, have disputed this claim that they intentionally buried their dead. This is a quote from one scientist who says, "Their explanation of Homo naledi repeatedly carrying their dead over the years and putting them in the chamber is tortuous and incredible." So it's been highly criticized by other scientists. Also, it's been claimed that Homo naledi had a human-like skull. Well, when I actually went to Maropeng Museum a few years ago, I had the opportunity to photograph a cast of the skull that they had on display. And look at the way that the face juts out from Homo naledi. That is a very ape-like trait. That is not a human-like looking skull. So be very careful with claims that it had a human-like skull. And I think that also would reflect upon its level of intelligence. So the biggest controversy was over the age of Homo naledi. And the reason why it was a controversy is because when the fossil was first discovered and being promoted to the public sort of in the hype phase, the claim was made that the fossil was between 2 to 3 million years old. But that date was never the result of a geological analysis. Okay, they never actually dated the fossil. That age for this fossil was driven strictly by evolutionary considerations, because they wanted the fossil to fit in that time period, because that's when it would be able to potentially be an ancestor of the genus Homo. Okay, so they did not really know how old the fossil was until a couple years later. When they finally dated it, it turned out that it was 1/10 of the age that they had initially proposed. It was 250,000 to 300,000 years, and the evolutionary prediction that it was 2 to 3 million years was wrong. This fossil is far too young to have been a human ancestor. It's literally, statistically impossible almost to say that this species was a human ancestor based upon what we know from the fossil record right now. So basically, this fossil could not have been a human ancestor. Did you see a bunch of news stories telling you that? Probably not, right? That you did not see that in the news, despite the fact that initially it was promoted as a new human ancestor. It could not have been a human ancestor. It is too young by millions of years. our genus Homo was already around long before the fossils we discover from Homo naledi. What's interesting, though, is that in 2010, many of the same fossil scientists who discovered and promoted Homo naledi were promoting a different intermediate or ancestor named Australopithecus sediba. And again, we see, the mainstream media quoting this scientist Lee Berger saying they make a very good candidate ancestor. However, we have the same problem with this species as well. It is found after the first evidence of our genus Homo in the fossil record. So this species cannot be an ancestor of something that's actually older than it is. You can't be, an ancestor of somebody who came before you did, okay? However, in evolutionary thinking, the fact that you have these sort of ordering, these chronological ordering problems in the fossil record, that does not really bother people too much. Because if the fossils are in the wrong order, what they do is they invent something called ghost lineages. They will say, oh, this fossil is too young to be where we want it to be, so we'll just say that maybe it actually existed far earlier in the fossil record than what we actually found, and we'll invent something called a ghost lineage. This is a real practice that's very frequently done. And so you can see this quote here from some scientists saying, on temporal grounds alone, one cannot dismiss the possibility that Australopithecus sediba could be ancestral to the genus Homo. Well, in a very clever study, some scientists actually tested this claim of whether or not this fossil could have been an ancestor to human beings. What they did is they measured the time differential between all these pairs of supposed ancestors and descendants in the hominid fossil record. They plotted them in this histogram, and they basically said that if Australopithecus sediba really is ancestral to humans, really is ancestral to genus Homo, even though it comes 800,000 years after the genus Homo first appears, they said that the likelihood of that being true, based upon what we know from other fossils in the hominid fossil record, is less than 0.001, okay? So this is a very clever way of statistically testing the claim that this fossil could have been our ancestor, even though it comes 800,000 years after the first evidence of our genus in the fossil record, okay? And in fact, if you were to extend this analysis for Homo naledi, it would be like 0.00001 with a bunch of zeros. I don't even know. But very, very unlikely that either of these two species could be our ancestor based upon what we know from the hominid fossil record. There's another problem with this. Remember, the same scientists that were promoting Homo naledi also promoted Australopithecus sediba as a human ancestor. But if it really was sort of an evolutionary lineage going from sediba to naledi to us, the problem is you have key traits that are evolving backwards. Some of Australopithecus sediba's traits are more human-like than we find in Homo naledi. So, for example, the pelvis, the teeth, and the hands of Australopithecus sediba are said to be more human-like than Homo naledi. So the problem is that if they are both in an evolutionary lineage, then key traits are evolving backwards. So Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi are unlikely to both be human ancestors in the same evolutionary lineage. The story is not making sense as an evolutionary story. So the problem, though, is now we're being left with all of these claims that were made when sediba was first discovered, saying, oh, this species fills all these gaps. Well, no, it doesn't. And we have papers saying things like the ancestry of Homo and its relation to earlier Australopithecines remain unresolved, or the origins of the genus Homo remain as murky as ever, or the transition to Homo continues to be almost totally confusing. If we don't have this species to plug this gap, then sort of these admissions of our ignorance are left hanging in the wind. We don't have any way to correct them. And so when we look at the origin of the genus Homo, this is basically the first species in the fossil record that looked like us, all right? That were very human-like. The technical scientific literature reports an explosion, rapid increase, punctuated change, or an approximate doubling of brain size at the appearance of our genus Homo around 2 million years ago. This is not what you want if you're an evolutionist. You want to have a slow, gradual change, not an explosion or rapid change. Punctuated means, again, sort of this abrupt appearance of new types of organisms. Another study looked at the pelvises of Australopithecines in humans and found very rapid evolution corresponding to the emergence of the genus Homo. Basically, we're seeing very, very rapid appearance of our genus Homo, species that look very human-like, but we don't see them evolving from the ape-like Australopithecines. There was an article that I mentioned earlier from the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution that said that we don't have transitional fossils from the Australopithecines to our genus Homo. But this is a longer quote from that same paper. It says, Homo erectus or Homo ergaster was significantly and dramatically different. These would be the first members of the genus Homo that were very human-like. Homo erectus or Homo ergaster was significantly and dramatically different from Australopithecines in virtually every remnant, every element of its skeleton, and every remnant of its behavior. The changes are sudden. No Australopithecine species is obviously transitional, a radical transformation, in other words, a genetic revolution. What they're saying is we don't see fossil evidence of how the Australopithecines evolved into humans. In fact, a commentator on this paper called it a Big Bang theory of human evolution, okay? So this is not what you want if you're an evolutionist. You don't want a Big Bang theory of human evolution. You want to see gradual evolution. That's not what we see. This is a quote from 3 Harvard paleoanthropologists writing about the supposed transition from Australopithecus into Homo. They said the transition from Australopithecus to Homo was undoubtedly one of the most critical in its magnitude and consequences. As with many key evolutionary events, there is both good news and bad news. Okay, so what's the bad news? Here's the bad news. First, the bad news is that many details of this transition are obscure because of the paucity of the fossil and archaeological records. That's pretty bad news. We don't really know many details about how this transition happened. So what's the good news? The good news is that although we lack many details about exactly how, when, and where the transition occurred, that's the good news, is that we lack many details about how, when, and where the transition occurred from Australopithecus to Homo. We have sufficient data from before and after the transition to make some inferences about the overall nature of key changes that did occur. So what are they saying here? What they're saying is that the fossil record provides the ape-like Australopithecines before and human-like Homo after the supposed transition, but not actual fossils documenting a transition between them. And in the absence of intermediates, we're left with an inference of a transition based upon the assumption of evolution. This is where those assumptions come into play. They look at the data and they assume evolution is true, and even if they don't see evidence for it, they just assume that the evidence is going to fill in those gaps. This is one last quote on this. This is from one of the leading evolutionary scientists of the 20th century named Ernst Mayr. He's talking about the origin of our genus Homo. He says, the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecines by a large unbridged gap. How can we explain this seeming saltation? A saltation is like a jump, a very rapid jump in the fossil record. He says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links, we have to fall back on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative. So we're basically constructing a narrative. We're telling a story of human evolution, even though he says we don't have any fossils that can serve as missing links. We have a large unbridged gap between the ape-like Australopithecines and the human-like members of Homo. This is, again, not making for a very convincing evolutionary story. And in fact, when I went to the Maripeg Museum, you can see these question marks here are key events in human evolution where we don't have fossils documenting how the evolutionary change took place. And this red one is actually documenting the precise place in the fossil record, supposedly, where our genus Homo evolved from the Australopithecines. And they put a question mark there. So I give them credit for making an honest admission of the gaps at the museum. But you have to know what's going on. You have to interpret this tree to understand what's going on. They're not going to outright say it, but at least they're acknowledging the gap in this diagram. And what's interesting is that when you look at the hominid fossil record, this problem of not having transitional fossils is actually very widespread. This is a quote from a major review of hominid evolution in 2015. It said, the evolutionary sequence for the majority of hominin lineages is unknown. Most hominin taxa, particularly early hominins, have no obvious ancestors, and in most cases, ancestor-descendant sequences, fossil time series cannot be reliably constructed. So there's a real problem throughout the hominid fossil record that we don't know how these lineages happen in an evolutionary perspective. So, okay, let's now close this up by talking about our genus Homo and how the major members of the genus Homo are very similar to modern humans. So in contrast to the Australopithecines, the major members of Homo, we're talking about Homo erectus and Neanderthals, are very similar to us. They're so similar that even some evolutionary scientists have classified Homo erectus and the Neanderthals as if they're members of our own species, Homo sapiens, okay? So you can compare the skulls. Yes, there are some differences in the skulls between erectus, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens, but the differences are very very minor. And in fact, even the changes and the differences in the skull sizes are all within the range of modern human genetic variation. You might be surprised to hear this, but Neanderthals actually had an average skull size that is slightly larger than modern humans. And even though Homo erectus did have a skull size that on average was smaller than the average of modern humans, it's still well within the range of modern human genetic variation. So I would say that, even if you see a diagram that is lining up these skulls, showing what looks like a very nice progression from small skulls to big skulls, don't be too impressed, because brain intelligence is far more complicated than the sole variable of brain size. In fact, this is a quote from the president of the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle. I've actually been there. I have a friend that works there. It says, total brain volume weakly correlates with intelligence. Brain size accounts for between 9 and 16% of the overall variability in general intelligence. So even if you see, different sizes of skulls and different brain capacities, that does not necessarily mean we're dealing with an unintelligent species. In fact, just sort of as an example of this, in the 19th century, there were two very famous writers, the Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev and the French novelist Anatole France. Turgenev's brain weighed about 2 kilograms, and Anatole France's brain weighed about 1 kilogram. So literally, Turgenev's brain was twice the size of Anatole France's brain, and yet they were both highly intelligent men, very good writers. So if you're a small brain person, don't despair. It doesn't mean you're not smart. Brain size is not all that there is to it, okay? So internal brain organization is much more complex and important for determining intelligence than is the sole dimension of brain size. What about Homo erectus? It's often depicted as if they didn't use technology, they were not very intelligent. Well, it turns out that we have found skeletons of Homo erectus on isolated islands. How did they get there? Well, the proposal is they had to get there by boat, okay? And if they're able to build boats, that's a sign of high intelligence right there. And building boats, these are quotes from a couple of scientists talking about this, building boats and then navigating the waterways to get there would require language. So even though we don't have direct, hard evidence of exactly how smart or unsmart Homo erectus was, I think we can infer, based upon some circumstantial evidence, that they had to be pretty smart and they may have even used language, okay? So Neanderthals, we often are told that Neanderthals are these bungling brutes. You call somebody a Neanderthal, and that is supposed to be, be an insult. Well, it turns out that Neanderthals were very, very similar to modern humans. This is a quote from a Washington University paleontologist. He says, or paleoanthropologist. He says, they may have had heavier brows or broader noses or stockier builds, but behaviorally, socially, and reproductively, they were all just people. So I would say that Neanderthals should kind of be viewed almost like a sub-race of modern humans. They were just, people that lived in Europe and the Middle East at a certain time in human history, and they were not necessarily any different from you and me. Another scientist says, Neanderthals were using technology as advanced as that of contemporary anatomically modern humans, and were using symbolism in much the same way. So I would say, a Neanderthal could walk in the room right now, and you may not be able to tell the difference. I could be a Neanderthal for all you know. So contrary to popular perceptions, Neanderthals do not show that humans are descended from primitive and or ape-like species. In fact, there are fossils that show evidence that humans and Neanderthals interbred. Some of you, if you do your 23andMe DNA studies, they will tell you, oh, you have Neanderthal DNA. So I would say, really, we're them and they are us. What's the difference? I don't really think there's a difference between us and them. In fact, a few years ago, there was a team of Israeli scientists who were creating an exhibit of Neanderthals, and it was immediately, discussed on the internet that one of the Neanderthal exhibits looked a lot like Chuck Norris, okay? And so, this then led to all kinds of Chuck Norris jokes, like, if Chuck Norris was a Neanderthal, he'd still be smarter, stronger, and more advanced than you. And there is no theory of evolution, just a list of animals that Chuck Norris allowed to live. Or Chuck Norris once kicked a horse in the chin, that's how the giraffe evolved. Okay, so anyway, we get these great Chuck Norris jokes, but the reality is that they looked very, very similar to us. There's a paleoanthropologist who said that the differences between these human-like members of the genus Homo can be explained as microevolutionary changes, small-scale evolutionary changes, what we would expect from something within a species, the effects of size variation, climatic stress, genetic drift, and differential expression of common genes. So these are small-scale microevolutionary changes. So what about intelligent design? Well, I didn't get into intelligent design very much tonight, but I'll give you guys a very, very brief crash course because we're kind of past time here. But intelligent design is a scientific theory which says that intelligence is, what it does is we produce information. Whenever we speak, whenever we act, whenever we think, we are producing information. And when we make things, those things are infused with large amounts of information. So what we see with this abrupt appearance of our genus Homo in these human-like forms in the fossil record is information being necessary to generate all the new information in the DNA, the genetic code, to produce these new types of organisms. But where in our experience does large amounts of information come from? This is a quote from some ID theorists who say, intelligent design provides a sufficient causal explanation for the origin of large amounts of information. The intelligent design of a blueprint often precedes the assembly of parts in accord with the blueprint or preconceived design plan. So when we see this new body plan, the human-like body plan, appearing rapidly and abruptly in the hominid fossil record without these evolutionary transitions, this represents a large amount of new information which was infused into the biosphere, into the natural world, and that is a telltale indicator that an intelligent agent was at work. So some take-home points here. Hominid fossils, they generally fit into two categories, ape-like and human-like species with a large unbridged gap between them. When we talk about the differences between the Australopithecines and humans, the ape-like genus of Australopithecines and the human-like members of the genus Homo, we see them acknowledging this sort of morphological gap or a genetic revolution. New information had to be inputted to produce all these genetic differences. When the genus Homo does appear in the fossil record, it does so abruptly. The fossil record does not show that we evolved from ape-like precursors, and this challenges standard Darwinian explanations for the origin of humans. And a Big Bang model, we saw that one person called this a Big Bang model of human origins, that requires the rapid origin of new genetic information, and that is best explained by intelligent design. I would like to think that Chuck Norris would approve of what I just said, and here's why, okay? I actually found the official Chuck Norris fact book, and here's what he said. I believe in microevolution, genetic mutations that provide small variations in different species in the animal kingdom. But I don't believe those micromutations lead to macroevolution, large genetic jumps that turn one animal into another, such as apes into humans. And all I have to say is, well said, Chuck, not bad for a Neanderthal. So thank you guys very much.